I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
The doorbell rang at 9:15 on a Monday morning, a time when the world usually has the decency to leave a man of Nero Wolfe's dimensions alone with his breakfast and his thoughts. I was in the office, giving the typewriter a workout on some routine reports, while 4 stories up, Wolfe was in the plant rooms with Theodore, likely lecturing a dendrobium on its lack of symmetry. I checked the one-way glass in the front door and saw a man who looked like he'd been ironed flat. He was thin, pale, and dressed in a grey suit that managed to be both expensive and entirely forgettable. I opened the door and kept the chain. If you're from the IRS, the office hours begin at 11. If you're a client, I hope UV brought your checkbook and a very interesting problem. My name is Sterling Vaughan, the man said. His voice was like dry paper. I don't care about the hour. I do care that someone has placed a note on Mr. Wolfe's desk. This morning, before the house was even unlocked, I felt the skin on the back of my neck do a little dance. I had been in the office since 8. Fritz had been in the kitchen since 7. Neither of us had seen a soul, and the front door had been bolted and chained all night. I slipped the chain and let him in, more out of curiosity than hospitality. "Vaughan, eh?" I said, escorting him into the office, the Sterling Vaughan Trust. "I thought you were currently busy merging with the Holloway Group and trying to keep your stock from tanking." He didn't answer. He walked straight to Wolfe's massive desk, his eyes fixed on the blotter. There, resting exactly in the center of the green leather, was a small, cream-colored envelope. It wasn't there 10 minutes ago. I know because ID just put a fresh stack of memo pads in the drawer. "Don't touch it," I warned, but he wasn't trying to. He was staring at it as if it were a coiled cobra. I waited until the clock struck 11. The elevator groaned sound of 1/7th of a ton of genius descending from the orchids. Wolfe stepped out, his yellow-gold eyes sweeping the room with the precision of a radar dish. He saw me, he saw the man in the iron suit, and then he saw the envelope. He didn't stop, but his lips tightened by a 1/16th of an inch. "That is Wolfe's version of a scream of rage, Archie," Wolfe said, navigating his bulk into the custom-made chair. "Explain." "This is Sterling Vaughan," I said. "He says that envelope contains a secret that was left here this morning. I can verify it wasn't there at 10:50. I can also verify that the front door was locked, the service door was bolted, and the windows are barred. Unless the ghost of Sherlock Holmes is making house calls, we have a breach." Wolfe didn't look at Vaughan. He looked at the envelope. He picked up his ivory letter, open near a tool he handles with the delicacy of a surgeon, and slit the paper. Inside was a single sheet of stationery with a single line of elegant looping script. "The merger is a funeral. The body is already in the room. Ask Julian." Wolfe's eyes flickered. Julian was Julian Vane, the auditor who had been found dead in our basement in the previous Cassia fact. That was supposed to be a closely guarded secret of the district attorney's office. "Mr. Vaughan," Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble, "you have trespassed upon my morning, and someone has trespassed upon my house. I do not like being used as a post office for anonymous threats." "Why are you here?" "Because Julian Vane was my cousin," Vaughan whispered. "And because that note isn't just a threat. It's a confession. Someone in this merge knows Julian died, and they know that you know. They are telling us that the brownstone isn't a sanctuary anymore. It's a crime scene." Wolfe leaned back, his fingers interlaced over his center of gravity. He looked at the note, then at the man, then at the bookshelves. The sanctity of the brownstone had been violated by a phantom who didn't need doors, and for Nero Wolfe, that was the only incentive he needed to take the case. "Archie," Wolfe said, his eyes narrowing, "lock the door, and tell Fritz to prepare the beer. It appears we have a ghost to exorcise." I reached for the heavy brass bolt and shot it home, the metallic thud echoing through the hallway with a finality that usually makes visitors reconsider their life choices. Sterling Vaughan didn't flinch, he just sank into the red leather chair as if his bones had suddenly turned to tall grass. I stood by the door, my eyes scanning the room. I've lived in this house for a long time, and I know its moods. Right now, the office felt like it was holding its breath. "The note," Wolfe said, his voice as flat as a sidewalk. "You say it was not there when you arrived, Archie." "It was not," I stated. "I dusted that blotter at 8:30. I put the mail in the tray at 9. The desk was bare as a pool ball. Fritz was in the kitchen, and I was in this room except for the 2 minutes it took me to go to the front door to let Mr. Vaughan in. Unless he's a world-class magician who can throw stationery while I am looking at his tie, he didn't put it there. Wolfe took the envelope with a pair of silver tweezers. He moved with a deliberation that suggested he was handling a live coal. He held the paper up to the light, his yellow gold eyes narrowing until they were just slits, watermarked, Old Hampshire bond. A classic choice for those who wish to appear established while delivering a threat. And the ink, a deep, saturated blue. The same ink, Archie, that we encountered in the matter of the dried orchid leaf and the hollowed-out blackstone. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the March wind. You mean our silent visitor didn't go to jail with the others? Or maybe they left a protégé behind? Or maybe, Wolfe murmured, we only caught the hands of the clock, and the mainspring is still ticking. He turned his gaze to Vaughan. Mr. Vaughan, you are the chairman of the Sterling Vaughan Trust. Your cousin, Julian Vane, was murdered in my basement. That fact is known to the police, to me, to Archie, and presumably to the killer. But this note suggests that Julian's death was merely a prelude. The merger is a funeral. Explain the Holloway Group's interest in your cousin. Vaughan wiped a bead of sweat from his upper lip. Julian wasn't just an auditor, Mr. Wolfe. He was the keeper of the grey ledger. It's a record of every offshore transaction the trust has made in the last decade. Many of those transactions were creative. Marcus Thorne knew about them. He was using that knowledge to force the merger. If the merger goes through, the grey ledger is absorbed into the Holloway archives and the trail goes cold. If it fails, the trust is exposed and we all go to prison. And the body is already in the room, I asked. Is that a metaphor, or should I start checking the floorboards again? It's a warning, Vaughan whispered. Someone is telling me that they have already infiltrated my inner circle. And now, they've shown me they can infiltrate yours. The brownstone disruption was no longer a theory. It was a physical reality. I looked at the windows, the bars solid and shadowed against the street. I looked at the hallway, where Fritz was standing with a tray of beer, his face pale and set. There are no secret passages in this part of the house I've checked. There are no hidden doors behind the bookshelves. And yet, a piece of paper had appeared on a desk in a room I had never left. Fritz, Wolfe said, his voice cutting through the tension. Set the tray down. And tell me, did you hear the service doorbell this morning? No, sir, Fritz replied, his voice trembling. I was in the kitchen from 7 o'clock. I did not leave the stove. But there was a draught, Mr. Wolfe, around 10 o'clock. A cold wind in the hallway, as if a window had been opened. I checked the pantry, but everything was shut. Wolfe didn't answer. He reached for a glass of beer, poured it with his usual surgical precision, and watched the foam settle. Archie. The morning mail. You said you placed it in the tray at 9. Did you examine the envelopes? Just the usual, I said. Bills, a catalogue for orchid supplies, and a letter from a woman in Ohio who thinks you're her long-lost brother. Nothing that looked like a funeral invitation. Bring it to me, Wolfe ordered. I handed him the stack. He leafed through it with a speed that belied his bulk. He stopped at a plain white envelope, postmarked from the Grand Central Station at midnight. There was no return address. He slit it open and pulled out a small, dried sprig of youth traditional greenery of the graveyard. The intrusion is complete, Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a register that made the glass on the desk vibrate. They have sent a note by hand and a symbol by post. They are mocking the very concept of my security. Mr. Vaughan, you will stay in the south room. Archie, you will call Saul Panzer. Tell him the shadow has returned, and this time it isn't lurking in the alley. It is breathing our air. The tension in the office was no longer a mystery, it was a siege. The silent visitor had crossed the threshold. For Nero Wolfe, the sanctity of the brownstone was now a battlefield. I showed Sterling Vaughan to the south room with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for a man walking toward a guillotine. He didn't protest, he just sat on the edge of the yellow silk bedspread and stared at his own reflection in the mahogany vanity as if he didn't recognize the face looking back at him. I locked the door quietly, so as not to hurt his feelings, and headed back down to the office. Wolfe was still in his chair, but the beer glass was empty, and he was staring at the sprig of yew with a grimace that suggested it was a personal affront to his horticultural standards. Vaughan is tucked in, I said, leaning against my desk, but he's about as useful as a leaky umbrella in a monsoon. He's terrified that Julian's grey ledger is going to turn up in a place where he can't explain it away. If that book exists, and if it's what the note implies, the Sterling Vaughan Trust isn't just merging with Halloway, it's being fed to it. Wolfe didn't look up. The grey ledger is a myth used by bookkeepers to frighten their superiors. However, in this instance, the myth has taken on a physical dimension. Julian Vane was a man of meticulous habits and a profound sense of self-preservation. If he kept such a record, he would not have left it in a safe or a bank vault. He would have placed it where its discovery would be catastrophic for his enemies and profitable for his allies. Archie considered the suspects. Who stood to gain the most from Julian's silence, and who stood to gain the most from his voice beyond the grave? I ticked them off on my fingers. First, there's Marcus Thorne, head of Holloway Group. He's the obvious choice. He wanted the merger, he wanted the assets, and he didn't want any pesky auditors pointing out that his own books are cooked. Then there's Elena Thorne, the niece with the green thumb and the cold heart. She's already shown she can crawl through a coal chute when she wants something. Third, we have Emil Hatch, the clerk who spent his life being stepped on. He knows where the bodies are buried because he probably helped dig the holes. And finally, there's our friend in the south room. Sterling Vaughan might be Julian's cousin, but in that family, blood is just something you use to sign a contract. Wolfe grunted. A quartet of ambition. But none of them explain the note on my desk. To bypass our security requires more than a motive. It requires an intimate knowledge of the brownstone's rhythm. It requires someone who knows that between 10 o'clock and 10:15, Fritz is occupied with the delivery of the heavy cream, and you are in the basement checking the water heater. It requires a ghost who has studied the house. I was in the basement for exactly 4 minutes, I reminded him. If someone slipped in, left a note, and slipped out in 4 minutes without tripping the alarm on the front door, they are not just Goodthea, invisible, or they never left, Wolfe murmured. He picked up the ivory letter opener again, tapping it against his palm. Archie. The grey ledger. Vaughan mentioned it was a record of offshore transactions. If Julian Vane were to hide such a document, he would choose a location that is both accessible and overlooked, a place that represents the very sanctity he sought to exploit. Go to the front room. Look behind the portrait of the previous owner, not the frame Archieth backing. I went into the front room. It's a formal space, filled with heavy furniture and a silence that usually tastes of dust and old money. I walked over to the portrait of the man who had built the house, a grim-faced Victorian who looked like he'd never enjoyed a meal in his life. I lifted the frame off the wall. Behind the heavy canvas, tucked into the recessed space of the lath and plaster, was a small, leather-bound volume. It was grey, scuffed, and smelled faintly of the damp earth of a cellar. I brought it back to the office and laid it on the desk. Wolfe didn't touch it. He looked at it like it was a piece of unexploded ordnance. The ledger of lost ambitions, he said softly. It was not placed there last night. It has been there for weeks. Julian Vane did not just hide a body in our basement. He turned this house into a safety deposit box for the destruction of the Sterling Vaughan Trust. But who knew it was there? I asked. If the note says the body is already in the room, and they mean the ledger, then the note was not a threat to Mr. Vaughan, Wolfe concluded, his eyes snapping open. It was a set of instructions for me. Someone wanted me to find this. Someone who knows that once I have the truth in my hands, I am incapable of letting it go. We are being manipulated, Archie. We are being used as the instrument of a justice that has no interest in our convenience. Call Saul Panzer. Tell him to watch the Holloway offices, and tell him that the silent visitor is no longer a guest. They are the host. I reached for the phone, my mind spinning. The ledger was in the office, the suspects were in the city, and the ghost was somewhere in the walls. The case was no longer a disruption. It was a takeover. I headed out into the biting wind of a Manhattan March, leaving Wolfe to contemplate the grey ledger with the same intensity a jeweler might use on a suspected fake. The instructions were clear. Find the shadow that was currently haunting the Holloway Group. If the note on the desk had been a set of instructions, then the person who wrote it was likely watching to see if the mountain would move. I took the subway uptown, blending into the crowd of midtown suits and harried messengers. The Holloway group occupied a skyscraper that looked like it had been constructed out of frozen smoke and bad intentions. I didn't go into the lobby instead. I took up a position in a drugstore across the street, nursing a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during the Hoover administration. Saul Panzer was already there, or rather, he was nearby. I didn't see him, which is the whole point of Saul. He's the only man I know who can stand in front of a neon sign and somehow look like a brick wall. My phone buzzed in my pocket a single vibration. That was the signal. I looked toward the side entrance of the Holloway building. A woman emerged. She wasn't Elena Thorne and she wasn't the assistant Miss Llewellyn. She was older, dressed in a sensible tweed coat, and she carried herself with the weary authority of someone who had spent 30 years organizing other people's chaos. She walked with a slight limp, heading toward a waiting taxi. The secretary, I muttered to myself. The one who knows where the staples are kept and which drawers don't lock. I flagged my own cab and told the driver to keep the yellowtail in sight. We headed toward the east side, weaving through the lunch hour gridlock. The taxi pulled up in front of a modest brownstone on 72nd Street, a far cry from the glass towers of Midtown. The woman got out, looked once over her shoulder with a sharp, bird-like flick of her head, and disappeared inside. I didn't follow her immediately. I waited for Saul to materialize beside my window, which he did with the silent efficiency of a ghost. "That's Martha Vane," Saul said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Julian's aunt. She's been the executive secretary for the Sterling Vaughan Trust since the day the doors opened. They say she has a memory like a filing cabinet and a heart like a ledger. And she's a Holloway building, isn't he? She's supposed to be loyal to the trust." "Loyalty is a luxury in a merger," Archie, Saul remarked. "I followed her this morning. She didn't go to the trust offices. She went to a private vault on 42nd Street, and then she went to Holloway. She's the one who's been feeding the fire." I looked at the brownstone. "She's the one who left the note, Saul. She knows the house. She was there 3 years ago when Julian brought her for a consultation about her sister's estate. She remembers the layout. She remembers the 15-minute window when the kitchen is empty." "But why the note?" Saul asked. "If she has the ledger, why give it to Wolfe?" "Because she doesn't have the ledger," I realized. "She knew Julian hid it in our house, but she couldn't find it. She was the draft Fritz felt in the hallway. She slipped in, searched the front room, and when she couldn't find the book, she left the note to force Wolfe to do the digging for her. She's using us as a retrieval service. I told Saul to stay in the house and let me know if anyone else showed up for tea. I headed back to 35th Street, my mind racing faster than the cab. If Martha Vane was the silent visitor, then the body in the room wasn't a metaphor for the ledger. It was a warning that the killer was already inside the inner circle of the merger and, likely inside our own house. When I got back to the brownstone, the atmosphere had curdled. Fritz met me at the door, his eyes wide. "Archie, the south room." "Mr. Vaughan." "He is not alone." I didn't wait for the elevator. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my hand on the butt of Marley. I reached the landing and saw the door to the south room standing open. Inside, Sterling Vaughan was slumped in a chair, his face white. Standing over him, looking remarkably calm, was Marcus Thorne. "A private consultation, Mr. Goodwin," Thorne said, his voice like velvet over gravel. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. Mr. Vaughan and I had a few technicalities to discuss regarding the grey ledger. I believe Mr. Wolfe has recently acquired it." The sanctity of the brownstone hadn't just been disturbed, it had been demolished. The Wolfe was in the fold, and he wasn't looking for orchids. I didn't draw the Marley, but I kept my hand where the holster lived. Marcus Thorne was standing by the window of the south room, looking at the city as if he owned the air rights to every building in sight. Sterling Vaughan looked like he'd been through a centrifuge, his tie was crooked, and his eyes were fixed on the floorboards. It was a pretty picture of corporate predator and prey, but it didn't belong on the 3rd floor of a private residence on West 35th Street. "The front door was locked," I said, my voice as dry as a desert bone. The chain was on. "Unless you've learned to liquefy and seep through the keyhole, Thorne, you've got about 10 seconds to explain how you're standing on this rug before I decide you're a burglar." Thorne turned, a thin, predatory smile stretching his face. "Mr. Goodwin, your indignation is charming but misplaced. I was invited, by a lady no less. She let me in through the service entrance while you were playing detective in Midtown. It seems your security is only as good as the people who hold the keys. I didn't like the sound of that. I liked it even less when I saw the kitchen stairs door open and Fritz appeared, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and suppressed rage. He didn't look at me, he looked at Wolfe, who had appeared at the end of the hallway, his bulk filling the space like a thundercloud. "Archie," Wolfe said, and the vibration of his voice made the crystal vase on the hallway table hum. "Mr. Thorne is a house guest for the next 5 minutes. Then he is a trespasser. Bring him to the office, and bring the jar of thyme from the kitchen." I looked at Fritz. Thyme. Did we run out of seasoning for the lamb? "It is not for the lamb, Archie," Fritz whispered, his voice trembling. "Someone has moved the spices again." The thyme was in the front of the rack. It is now in the back, behind the cloves. And the seal, the wax seal I put on the jar to keep the air out, has been broken. I escorted Thorne and a very shaky Vaughan down to the office. Wolfe was already in his chair, the grey ledger sitting on his blotter, like a tombstone. He didn't look at the men, he looked at the small glass jar of thyme I set before him. He picked it up, unscrewed the lid, and tipped the contents onto a sheet of white paper. Among the dried green leaves, a small silver key tumbled out. It was a safety deposit box key, stamped with the number 402 and the insignia of the Chelsea National Bank. The grey ledger was the map. "Archie," Wolfe murmured, his eyes fixed on the key. But the theme was the destination. Julian Vane did not just hide a book, he hid the access to the evidence that the book only describes. And he did so by enlisting the help of someone who knows Fritz's kitchen, as well as I know the plant rooms. "I told you," Thorne said, leaning over the desk. "The merger is a done deal. That key is Holloway Group. Whatever Julian Vane thought he was doing it with company funds. He'll take that now." "You will take nothing," Wolfe snapped, and for a moment I thought he was going to stand up and throw the man out himself. "You are here because Martha Vane let you in. She let you in because she wanted you to see that the game is over. She has been playing both sides, Mr. Thorne. She gave you the instructions to come here, and she gave me the instructions to find the ledger. She is the body already in the room, the presence that you cannot see because you are too busy looking at the balance sheets. Martha." Vaughan gasped, finally finding his voice. "She's been with the trust for 30 years. She wouldn't betray us." "She isn't betraying the trust," Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal hum. "She is avenging her nephew. She knew Julian was being squeezed by both. She knew he wouldn't survive the merger, so she helped him hide the truth, and then she waited for the right moment to expose the rot. But she made a mistake. She thought she could control the pressure." Wolfe looked at the jar of thyme, then at the grey ledger. The displaced spice was a signal, Archie, a signal that the secondary vault one Saul found in the judge's house has been emptied. "Everything has been moved here. Into the brownstone. We aren't just holding the evidence, we are sitting on the entire assets of the Sterling Vaughan Trust." The phone on my desk rang. It was Saul. "Archie, the 72nd Street house is empty. Martha Vane just left in a black sedan. She's heading your way, and she isn't alone. She's got 2 men with her, and they aren't wearing bank suits." I looked at Wolfe. The pressure was no longer outside. It was leaning against the front door. "Thorne," I said, reaching for my holster, "I hope you brought more than just an invitation, because the party is about to get very loud." I reached for the telephone and dialed Saul's mobile number, my eyes never leaving Marcus Thorne. Thorne was still wearing that look of polished arrogance, but there was a flicker of something else behind his ice, the kind of look a man gets when he realizes the ground he's standing on is actually a trapdoor. Saul answered on the first ring, his voice as steady as the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I gave him the word. The party was moving to the front porch, and we needed the guest list vetted immediately. "They are 2 minutes out, Archie," Saul said. The black sedan just turned onto 35th. Martha Vane is in the back seat, and she's got company that doesn't look like they've ever worked in a bank. One of them is a fellow named Hackett, a freelance specialist in negotiation who usually carries his arguments in a shoulder holster. "We're ready for them," I said, though ready was a relative term when you had 2 corporate sharks in the office and a mountain of intellect behind the desk who refused to move. I hung up and looked at Wolfe. He hadn't touched the silver key or the grey ledger. He was staring at the glass jar of time as if he could see the DNA of the person who had moved it. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice dropping into that deep, resonant register that meant the tactical phase was over and the siege had begun. "Mr. Thorne and Mr. Vaughan are no longer guests. They are variables. Move them to the front room and ensure the bolt on the service door is reinforced. We are not merely protecting a ledger, we are protecting the integrity of this house." I didn't need to be told twice. I got Thorne and Vaughan moving toward the front room. Thorne blustered about his lawyers and the Holloway Group's influence, but I gave him a look that told him my patience was currently at a very low ebb. I shoved them into the formal parlor, locked the heavy oak doors, and headed back to the office just as the doorbell rang. It wasn't a polite ring. It was the long, demanding buzz of someone who knows they have the upper hand. I checked the one-way glass. It was Martha Vane. She was alone on the stoop, her tweed coat buttoned to the chin, looking like a grandmother who had lost her way to the library. But parked at the curb was the black sedan Saul had described, and I could see the silhouette of a man in the driver's seat who was definitely not there to open doors for her. "Let her in, Archie," Wolfe's voice boomed from the office, "but leave the chain on. I wish to see the face of the woman who thinks she can outmaneuver me in my own kitchen." I opened the door a crack. Martha Vane didn't look afraid. She looked exhausted, with the kind of bone-deep weariness that comes from a lifetime of keeping other people's secrets. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, her voice thin but sharp, "I've come for the key, and for Julian's legacy. If you don't give them to me, the men in that car will ensure that this house becomes as silent as the grave Julian was left in." "A dramatic entrance, Miss Vane," I said, leaning against the frame. "But Mr. Wolfe doesn't care for threats, and I don't care for people who mess with Fritz's spice rack. Why the time? Why the note?" "Because you were the only ones who could find it," she snapped, her eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce intelligence. "I knew Julian had hidden the key in the kitchen, but I couldn't find the right jar. I had to make Wolfe look. I had to make the silent visitor real so he would take the case seriously. Now, the key. Give it to me, and I'll ensure that Thorne and Vaughan are the only ones who pay for what happened to my nephew." "The key is on the desk," Wolfe called out from the office, his voice echoing through the hallway. "But it is not for you, Miss Vane. It is for the person you are truly afraid of, the person who is currently sitting in the back of that sedan, waiting for you to fail." Martha Vane went pale. She looked back at the car, and for the first time, I saw the terror behind her eyes. The midnight watch wasn't just about Saul guarding the street, it was about realizing that the shadow we were fighting wasn't a secretary or a CEO. It was a phantom that had been using Martha just as much as she had been using us. "The pressure is mounting, Archie," Wolfe murmured as I stepped back into the office. "Cole's owl. Tell him to move. The shadow is about to step into the light, and I want the spotlight to be blinding." I went to the window and adjusted the heavy drapes, leaving just a sliver of glass exposed to the street. Outside, the black sedan was still like a squat predator. I couldn't see the driver's face, but I could see the glow of a cigarette, a tiny, orange coal that pulsed with the rhythm of a man who was getting bored of waiting. I relayed the position to Saul over the internal line. He was already in the basement of the house next door, having slipped through the judge's coal tunnel, while Martha Vane was busy keeping me occupied at the front door. "The pressure is a physical property, Archie," Wolfe said, his voice resonant in the quiet office. "Like steam in a boiler, it must be directed. If we allow it to dissipate, the suspects will merely drift away into the fog of legal technicalities. We must ensure that the only exit remains this room." He picked up the silver key from the blotter, turning it over in his thick fingers. "Mr. Thorne and Mr. Vaughan are currently in the front room, marinating in their own mutual distrust. Miss Vane is on our stoop, caught between the sanctuary she violated and the masters she serves, and the man in the car, one who truly pulled the strings of Julian Vane's consciences, waiting for a signal that will never come." "So what's the move?" I asked. "Do I invite the fellow with the cigarette in for a beer, or do we just wait for him to run out of smokes?" "Neither," Wolfe said. "We use the art of indirect pressure. Archie, go to the front room. Do not speak to the prisoners. Simply open the door, walk to the center of the rug, and place this jar of time on the mantelpiece. Then, Walk out and lock the door again. Do not answer any questions. I took the jar. It felt light, but carrying it into the front room felt like carrying a live grenade. I unlocked the oak doors and entered. Thorne was pacing the length of the Persian rug, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Vaughan was slumped on the sofa, looking like head-aged 10 years since breakfast. They both started toward me the moment the latch clicked, their mouths open to let out a torrent of demands. I didn't give them the chance. I walked past them as if they were part of the upholstery, reached up, and set the glass jar of time exactly in the center of the marble mantel. The green leaves shifted behind the glass, a tiny forest of evidence. I turned heel and walked out. Thorne's shout of "Goodwin, you stay here," was cut off by the heavy thud of the door and the uncompromising snap of the lock. "The seed is planted," I told Wolfe as I returned to the office. Thorne looked like he wanted to eat the glass, and Vaughan looked like he wanted to hide under the sofa. What does a jar of spice do to a man's nerves? "It reminds them of the kitchen," Wolfe murmured, "and the kitchen reminds them of the breach, and the breach reminds them that Julian Vane was not as solitary as they assumed. They are now wondering which of them moved that jar. They are wondering if the other has already made a deal with me. The vacuum of information is the greatest architect of a confession." Wolfe then turned his attention to the telephone. He dialed a number from memory's private line of the Commissioner of Banks. He didn't ask for a favor, he issued a statement. He informed the Commissioner that the Sterling-Vaughan merger was no longer a matter of finance, but of felony, and that the Chelsea National Bank's Vault 402 was to be sealed by executive order until further notice. "Now," Wolfe said, hanging up the receiver with a sharp click, "the secondary vault is sealed. The primary evidence is on my desk. The suspects are fermenting in the front room. The only thing missing is the catalyst. Archie, the service door. Open it. Not wide just enough to let the draft in. Let our silent visitor realize that the house is no longer a fortress, but a trap." I went to the hallway and slipped the bolt on the service door. I left it ajar by an inch. The cold, damp air of the alleyway came snaking in, bringing with it the smell of wet pavement and the distant, muffled sound of a car door closing. The shadow was moving. I checked the Marley. 38 in my holster, feeling the familiar tension in my shoulders. We were no longer playing at being hosts. We were positioning the pieces for the final confrontation. Nero Wolfe was orchestrating the movement from his throne, using nothing but the weight of his presence and a jar of herbs to break the will of men who thought they were kings of the city. "They are coming, sir," I whispered, stepping back into the office. "Of course they are," Wolfe said, closing his eyes. "Logic demands it, and logic, Archie, is the only guest I never turn away." The office was no longer a room, it had become a pressurized chamber, and Nero Wolfe was the one with his hand on the valve. I had ushered Marcus Thorne and Sterling Vaughan from the front room, their faces pale and their eyes darting toward the desk, where the grey ledger sat like an unexploded bomb. Martha Vane had finally been brought in from the stoop, her tweed coat damp from the mist, and her expression one of frozen, desperate defiance. She sat in the smallest yellow chair, her hands clenching a leather handbag as if it contained the last of her dignity. "Sit," Wolfe commanded. It wasn't a request. It was a gravitational pull that sucked the remaining air out of the room. They sat. Thorne took the red leather chair, leaning forward with the predatory grace of a man who still thought he could buy his way out of a landslide. Vaughan hovered near the bookshelves, looking like he wanted to merge with the wall. Saul Panzer was already there, standing by the hallway door, his hands in his pockets and his eyes fixed on the man who had followed Martha Vane inside of the driver from the black sedan. He was a thick-necked specimen named Hackett, and he looked like he'd been carved out of a sidewalk. "We are assembled," Wolfe began, his voice dropping into that low, resonant hum that usually precedes a funeral, "not to discuss the Holloway Group's acquisition of the Sterling-Vaughan Trust, but to discuss a trespass. A note was left on my desk. A jar of thyme was moved in my kitchen. A sprig of yew was sent through the mail. These are not merely theatrics, Mr. Thorne. They are the signatures of a conspiracy that has used this house as its primary ledger." "I don't care about your spice rack, Wolfe," Thorne snapped, though his eyes kept flickering toward the silver key. "I care about that ledger. It's proprietary information. It belongs to the Holloway Group by right of contract. Right of contract. Wolfe's eyes snapped open, yellow gold and cold as a mountain lake. You speak of rights while standing in a house you violated? You, Mr. Thorne, are a mathematical illiterate who believes that if you bury a debt deep enough, it ceases to exist. But Julian Vane knew better. He knew debt is a physical property. He hid the proof of your larceny in my basement, and when he was murdered for his trouble, he left the map in my library. Vaughan found his voice, though it sounded like it had been dragged through gravel. Julian was my cousin. He was trying to protect the trust from Thorne's stripping. He told me Head put the grey ledger where no one would dare look, and he did, Wolfe said, tapping the scuffed volume on his blotter. But he didn't count on the silent visitor who has been moving through these walls. Miss Vane, you were the one who let Mr. Thorne in through the service door, were you not? You were the one who moved the time to signal Mr. Hackett that the coast was clear. Martha Vane didn't flinch. I did what I had to do to ensure Julian's work wasn't wasted. Thorne killed him, Mr. Wolfe. He killed him in that coal tunnel because Julian wouldn't give up the key to Vault 402. I wanted you to find the ledger so the world would see what Thorne is. I didn't care about trespassing. I cared about justice. Justice? Wolfe's lip curled in a rare display of open contempt. You speak of justice while acting as a conduit for a murderer. You did not move that jar to help me, Miss Vane. You moved it to help Mr. Hackett. You were looking for the key yourself, and when you couldn't find it, you tried to use my intellect as a divining rod. You brought the wolf into the fold and expected me to be the shepherd. Hackett moved then, a subtle shift of his weight toward the desk, but Saul Panzer's hand came out of his pocket holding a .38 with the casual familiarity of a man holding a fountain pen. Hackett froze. The gathering is complete, Wolfe said, leaning back and interlacing his fingers over his center of gravity. The grey ledger details the fraud. The silver key reveals evidence of laundering, and the note on my desk, that was the final error. It was written in a deep, saturated blue ink, same ink found on the fountain pen in Mr. Thorne's pocket. You didn't write the note to expose the truth, Miss Vane. Mr. Thorne wrote it to frame you for the breach. The silence that followed was absolute. Thorne's face turned a mottled purple, and Vaughan looked like he was about to faint. The silent visitor wasn't a ghost, it was a boardroom executioner who had tried to turn Nero Wolfe's office into a theatre of the absurd. Archie, Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a whisper, the signal. I believe Inspector Cramer has waited in the alley long enough. Tell him the body in the room is ready for the morgue. I didn't have to reach for the telephone. The doorbell rang again, but this time it wasn't the demanding buzz of a corporate raider, it was the rhythmic, authoritative thumping of a man who had a badge in his pocket and a quota of frustrations to fill. I opened the door to let Inspector Cramer in. He looked like a man who had been sitting in a cold car for 3 hours, which he had, and he was chewing on an unlit cigar, with a ferocity that suggested he wished it were Marcus Thorne's neck. All right, Wolfe, Cramer barked, stepping into the office and letting a gust of wet March air follow him. I've got the judge's basement secured, I've got the black sedan in a pincer, and I've got enough blue-bound folders to start a library. Now, what's this about a body in the room? Wolfe didn't even open his eyes. He leaned back. His bulk settled into the chair like a mountain that had finished moving. The body, Inspector, is not biological. It is the corpus of the Sterling Vaughan Trust, which has been systematically murdered by the gentleman in the red leather chair. Mr. Thorne, if you would be so kind as to produce the fountain pen from your breast pocket, I believe the inspector would find the ink quite familiar. Thorne didn't move. He looked at Cramer, then at Saul's. 38, then back at Wolfe. The polished arrogance was finally beginning to flake away, revealing the desperate, small-time gambler underneath the $500 suit. The note on my desk, Wolfe continued, his voice as smooth as 19th-century brandy. It was written in a deep, saturated blue Inca Vintage Pelican 100N, I believe. It is a connoisseur's pen, one that Mr. Thorne acquired from Julian Vane's estate shortly after the accident in the coal tunnel. He didn't just kill the man, he looted the man's stationery. He wrote the note himself, using Martha Vane as a distraction, to lead me to the ledger. He wanted the ledger found, Inspector, but only after he had cleaned it of the pages that implicated him. That's a lie, Thorne rasped. I came here because Martha told me the ledger was here. You came here because the vacuum of your own greed forced you, Wolfe snapped, his eyes flashing open. You knew Julian had hidden the key to Vault 402. You thought that by involving me, you could use my reputation to legitimize the discovery of the ledger, while you slipped the key into your own pocket. You underestimated the fact that I do not merely look at ledgers, I look at the order of my house. Time displacement was the final signature. Only someone who had been watching this house for Desimione like your man Hackett could have known the exact moment to slip through the service door. Cramer stepped forward, his hand out. The pen, Thorne. Now. Thorne hesitated, then slowly reached into his pocket and handed over the silver-capped pen. Cramer took it, unscrewed the cap, and looked at the nib. Blue ink, he muttered. The same stuff that was on the note we found in Julian's pocket at the morgue. Exactly, Wolfe said. The note Julian supposedly wrote before he fell. It was a forgery, written with that very pen. Mr. Thorne has been writing his way into a fortune, but he has ended up writing his way into a cell. The grey ledger on my desk is complete, Mr. Thorne. I found it behind the portrait of the previous owner before you had a chance to edit it. It contains the record of every penny you stripped from the trust. Martha Vane let out a low, shuddering sob. He told me he'd save the trust. He told me Julian was the one who was stealing. He told you what you wanted to hear to keep the service door open, Wolfe said, his voice dropping to a low, steady hum. And you, Mr. Vaughan, were too cowardly to see the truth, even when it was sitting on your own mantelpiece. You are not a murderer, but you are a parasite who was willing to let your cousin's killer walk through your front door if it meant your pension was safe. Cramer signalled to his men. The office was suddenly very full as the handcuffs were produced. Thorne was led out first, his face a mask of silent, boiling rage. Hackett followed, his jaw set, and finally, Martha Vane, who looked like she had aged 20 years in a single afternoon. Sterling Vaughan was the last to go, escorted by a sergeant who looked like he had no patience for corporate technicalities. Wolfe waited until the front door closed. He stayed in his chair, his hands resting on his lap, staring at the empty spot where the jar of time had been. The silence of the brownstone began to return, but it was a heavy, bruised silence. Archie, Wolfe said after a long moment, the grey ledger. Is it still on the blotter? Right here, I said, picking it up. Along with the silver key. What do we do with them? Put them in the safe, Wolfe ordered. I shall call the district attorney in the morning. For now, the house requires a different kind of order. Fritz. Fritz appeared in the doorway, his face pale but his eyes bright. Yes, sir. The time, Wolfe said. Is it ruined? No, sir, Fritz replied. I have already replaced it with a fresh batch. And the lamb is perfectly seasoned. Good, Wolfe grunted. Then let us eat. The disruption is over. The mountain is no longer awake, it is hungry. The front door closed with a heavy, vibrating thud that seemed to shake the very dust from the crown moulding. It was the sound of the municipal machinery finally grinding to a halt, taking with it the sirens, the flashbulbs, and the sour scent of Inspector Cramer's cheap cigars. I stood in the hallway for a moment, letting the silence of the brownstone rush back in to fill the gaps. It is a specific kind of silence ethic, scholarly, and expensive. I checked the bolt, slid the chain, and made sure the service door was locked tight enough to discourage even a particularly determined ghost. When I walked back into the office, the transformation was already underway. Wolfe had not moved from his chair, but the atmosphere had shifted from a battlefield to a sanctuary. The grey ledger was gone, tucked into the back of the wall, safe behind the portrait of a man who looked like Head never had a creative thought in his life. The silver key was in a velvet-lined drawer, and the desk blotter had been wiped clean of any trace of blue ink. The binder called, I said, leaning against the edge of my desk. He can pick up the Blackstone tomorrow morning. He says, if the hollowed-out section didn't hit the stitching, he can make it look like Julian Vane never existed. Or at least like his stationery didn't. Wolfe didn't look up. He was staring at the space on the rug where Marcus Thorne had stood, a spot that now looked suspiciously like it needed a good scrubbing. A cosmetic repair, Archie. We can replace paper and leather, but we cannot replace the illusion of invulnerability. This house was treated as a counting room for a thief. That is a stain that does not come out with soap. Well, the thief is currently being fitted for a jumpsuit, I reminded him. and Martha Vane is going to have plenty of time to rethink her filing system. We held the fort, even if the fort got a little dusty in the process. I'd say that's worth a bonus, or at least a glass of that milk Fritz keeps in the back of the cooler. Fritz appeared in the doorway, his apron smoothed and his face restored to its natural state of serene domesticity. The smell of the lamb was no longer a promise, it was a command. It drifted into the office, carrying notes of rosemary and that freshly replaced thyme, effectively evicting the last lingering traces of the Holloway Group's corporate gloom. "Dinner is served, Mr. Wolfe," Fritz said. "The endives are exactly as you like them. I have opened a bottle of the 1921 Montrachet." Wolfe stood up, his bulk rising with a deliberate tectonic grace. He adjusted his silk tie and smoothed his waistcoat, reclaiming his role as the master of the domain. "Thank you, Fritz. We shall be there momentarily." Archie, the fountain pen. "Did Mr. Cramer take the inkwell as well?" "He took everything that wasn't nailed down," I said. "He'll be checking the chemical composition of that blue ink until his eyes cross. He's convinced there's a secret code in the loops of the M in merger." Wolfe grunted, a sound of profound intellectual dismissal. Mr. Cramer would find a secret code in a grocery list if it were written in a language he didn't understand. Code was out of ink, Archie. It was in the intent. Mr. Thorne believed that by mimicking the silent visitor, he could vanish into the shadow of a previous crime. He failed to realize that a shadow is only possible when there is a solid object to cast it. He was never solid. He was a vacuum of ethics wrapped in a layer of expensive wool. We walked into the dining room where the candlelight was reflecting off the silver and the crystal with a steady, reassuring glow. Wolfe took his seat at the head of the table, his eyes lingering for a moment on the English mustard pot. It was full, it was clean, and it was blissfully free of industrial epoxy. "You know," I said, unfolding my napkin, "it's funny. Martha Vane thought she was being clever by using us to find the key. Thorne thought he was being clever by framing her. In the end, they both got tripped up by a spice jar. It's a bit of a come-down for a multi-million-dollar merger." Wolfe picked up the carving knife, testing the edge with a thumb that knew exactly what it was looking for. "The scale of the ambition is irrelevant, Archie. Whether a man seeks to steal a kingdom or a jar of time, the flaw remains the same. He assumes the world is as disorganized as his own conscience. He forgets that some things like the order of a kitchen or the integrity of a sentencier not subject to negotiation." He sliced into the lamb with a precision that was almost poetic. The merger was a funeral, as the note suggested, but it was the funeral of a delusion. Now, let us eat. I find that the exposure of a corporate predator is an excellent stimulant for the appetite, but a poor substitute for a well-cooked meal. "Ill drink to that," I said, reaching for the wine. "Just as long as we don't find any more notes on the desk tomorrow morning. I'd like to get through one day where the only thing I have to type is a grocery list." Wolfe didn't answer. He was already busy with the endives, his mind having retreated into the only sanctuary that truly mattered, one where the logic was sound, the wine was cold, and the world outside was kept strictly on the other side of the bolt. "I've been working for the man for a long time, and I've learned that when he hits that particular stride, the best thing to do is keep your mouth shut and pass the salt. The brownstone was quiet, the mountain was fed, and for one more night, the sanctity of the sanctum was preserved."